Hello all, Old Geek here, and hopefully the builders working on my neighbour's house will stop drilling long enough for me to record this video, but if not, I apologise in advance. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the most interesting weapon category in gaming. In my opinion, of course, but isn't this channel all about opinions? And that opinion is formed by my love of medieval history. And that category is the polearm. We all remember, well, some of us do, maybe, if our memories still work. We all remember opening that first edition player's handbook and looking at that weapons list. And how many of you said, Bector Corbin? What the hell is that? Ha ha ha! Bohemian ear spoon! Ha 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 ha! And how many DMs allowed clerics to use lucerne hammers? Because they didn't know what they were. And how many players attempted to force their DMs to let their clerics use lucerne hammers? It says it's a hammer. It says clerics can use hammers. So, no. So, polearms. What do all those names mean? And what did they look like? And did AD&D get them remotely right? Well, a lot of us learnt what they look like, sort of, with Unearthed Arcana, that lovely chapter at the end of the book. One of the best chapters in the book, in my opinion. But they weren't always that simple. And it took, in that period before Unearthed Arcana came out, a lot of us were in the dark. Now, even though I don't play with the weapons versus AC modifiers table, I will be referring to it in this video because, of course, it's there in the rulebook to help differentiate weapon effectiveness. It is a flawed table, in my opinion, but that's for reasons I won't get into in this video. The order in which I will be discussing the various weapons will be in rough chronological order. Many of the options do overlap and are simply modified versions of earlier weapons. But such is the nature of technology. And as such, the specific definitions of each weapon can be grey areas. Anyhow, with that wriggle room established, to give me a bit of a get out in case any of you moan, here we go. The polearm is essentially an evolution of one of the most versatile of battlefield weapons. Simple, cheap, effective, the spear. Unarguably the single most important weapon for centuries. The long pointy stick, you can stab with it, you can parry with it, you can throw it. You can do all of this from a relatively safe distance. Polearms were then attempts to add extra functionality to this. Hooks, bashing, cleaving, whatever. So let's start with the early ones, the simpler ones. And many of these were made by putting a smaller weapon, or a tool, on the end of a long stick. Such as this, a polearm that first appeared way back in the 11th century, one of the very earliest pole weapons, and that is the Forsha. It's not a forchard, it's French, Forsha. In its basic form, it's a scythe-like blade on a long pole. And the blades varied in size and shape, but the main aim was to replicate the effect of a sword, but from a distance. Forsha blades were typically only sharp, though, on the convex side, and that sadly made them pretty rubbish. A similar weapon, at least initially, was the glaive. In its most basic form, it was also a single-edged sword on the end of a pole. But it appears to have evolved a little more sensibly than the Forsha, and historical examples do look to have had weightier blades. Still, it did suffer from similar issues, namely that it could only really slash. But those evolutions, they made a difference, and I'll come to some of those later. Arguably more effective, well, it's not arguably at all, it just was more effective, was the Gizam, and its English version, the bill. Yes, it's Gizam, it's French again, it's not Guizarm. It was also very simple in its design, but the key was the fact that the cutting edge was typically the concave side, and the hook was more pronounced. You could hook enemies, cut them at the same time, pull them over, pull them off their horses. Job done. Well, mostly. The next relatively early polearm was the Voge, a big cleaver on the end of a stick. Again, it is simple, but it's a heftier blade than those of the weapons I've already mentioned. Give it a bit more momentum, squish your enemies. Certainly it would be a little more effective when up against armour, but also probably a little more cumbersome. So people started getting clever and trying to combine the functions of the weaponry. And one of the earliest combinations was the spetum, an enlarged spearhead with a couple of prongs either side to trap foes, to parry, maybe catch weapons. They were forward-facing prongs, and thus they were good against enemy weapons, but not as effective as the hooked weapons were at dealing with riders or tripping enemies. In a desperate attempt to make the Forsha better, they added some spikes to it, to give us the Forshaft fork. But look at this example. The spike effectively makes the already weak cutting blade redundant, as it gets in the way. It can now stab a little bit, but at the cost of any slashing potential. Yes, this appears to be a very extreme example, but you can see the problems with the design. And if you look at AD&D's stats for these weapons, did Gygax get them right? Now I've put the weapons that can dismount a rider in italics, and those capable of disarming an opponent in bold. Well, I think he overdid the Forshaft fork for a start. The Voge's bonus against moderately armoured individuals looks to be in the right ballpark, and yes, I think the spetum's enhanced spear-like qualities would work well against unarmoured opponents. I think you should though slightly reduce spetum damage though against large creatures and heavily nerf the abysmal Forshaft fork. And I don't think the curve of the Forsha was sufficient to dismount, certainly not the examples I've seen. Anyway, let's move on to the Middle Era. It is a vague term, but I'm going to cover some of the early evolutions of the weapons I've mentioned so far. Starting with the Glaive Gizam. Give the already somewhat effective cutting blade a secondary hooked spike feature on the back, and you have potential to cause mayhem, as you can now slice and use the back of the weapon to rip and hook. It would still struggle to penetrate heavy armour, but who really needs to when you can pull them to the floor and then use the blade on them? In a similar vein, they added a hook to the Voge to make the Gizam, probably best typified by this Scottish Lochaber axe. Now I think Gygax over-egged the length of this weapon a little bit, and its D&D stats were nearly identical to the basic Voge. There was just the added dismount capability. It is a weapon I think is one for the battlefield rather than the dungeon, but I suppose that's true for many of this class of weapon. The Ranseur is the next one I'm going to look at, which was an evolution of the earlier spetum, but it was portrayed in D&D as a weaker form of that weapon, and I don't really get why. If you know, then tell me in the comments. Yes, it does have the added dismount ability, but that's quite situational, and it has reduced damage capability and less chance to hit unarmoured foes. If I was an adventurer, I would pick the spetum based on stats alone. Before I move into the later weapons, let's take a look at those which, for various reasons, spanned the eras. Starting with the Bardiche. Take a big axe. Make it even bigger. This is the big two-handed axe of AD&D. The one that would generally be known as the Great Axe in later editions and other games. And I don't think we realised that when we were kids. It's shorter than most of the weapons in the polearm category, with a massive axe blade. What's not to like about this? Its AD&D stats are good too, especially against unfortunate opponents in light or no armour. It's a grossly underused weapon in AD&D in my opinion. Also in this grouping is the all pike. It's not a dungeon weapon, but instead it's a real open battlefield game changer. Its inclusion in fantasy gaming is somewhat of a holdover from wargaming days, as it really can't be a tool for an adventurer. But if you do get your game up to stronghold levels, give these to your foot soldiers and enjoy. The other weapon I've put here is the military fork. It's basically a modified pitchfork. Certainly this would have been effective used by mass ranks of peasants, but I think Gygax somewhat overdid its usefulness, overdid its damage, and under-penalised it a little against heavy armour, as by comparison with many others here, those prongs look to be very lightweight and flimsy. Okay, now on to the big boys, the later weapons, the ultimate evolutions. These were largely used on battlefields when plate armour had become much more common, and thus their modifications reflect that. Right, starting with one that annoys me. Not the weapon itself, but its depiction in D&D, and that is the Billizarm. It does do solid damage in D&D, but it has very few bonuses or penalties against armour types and no real special abilities, and yet this was a dominant polearm in the early 16th century because of its immense versatility. It could hook, it could cut, it could stab, it did all three. The English forces slaughtered the Scottish pikemen at Flodden Field because of this weapon and how it could be adapted to the conditions. But for D&D purposes, give it the disarm capability and I think it would be okay. Next, the polearm that comes to mind first for many, and that is the halberd. These came in many shapes and sizes, but the basic design was the cleaving ability of a Voge or an axe, the stabbing ability of a spear, and then with a back spike or hook akin to the Gizam type weapons. This would make it solid against most opponents, no matter what their armour, and it had great damage potential. But Gygax still got these wrong, in my opinion. Or rather, the fantasy love affair with swords shifted the game balance away from them. In real life, halberd, or two-handed sword, give me the halberd. The partisan is next, and these were odd in my opinion. Now, they were an evolution of the spear, the ranseur, the spetum, those type of weapons, but visually they resemble an overweight ranseur, and it's no surprise that their main purpose in real life appears to have been mostly ceremonial. Their D&D stats are very forgettable, and I do think that is correct. Finally, we have two weapons which D&D criminally underrated, and which were similar in both appearance and function in real life. Those are the bec de corbin, it's not a bec de corbin, it's a bec de corbin, and the lucerne hammer. As I said at the start of the video, this is not a weapon used by clerics. The lucerne hammer is very spiky. These were the Swiss army knives of the battlefield. Both featured small, often spiked hammerheads which were designed to concentrate immense force on armoured opponents. It's pointless trying to go through a well-made breastplate. Just knock it out of shape and shatter a few ribs in the process. The hammerheads were combined with spikes and, in the case of the bec de corbin, a tin opener like rear blade, which was perfect for getting into the joints between the armour plates. As for D&D, their usefulness is reflected in the weapon versus AC modifiers, but the damage is pitiful in my opinion. They almost needed a new mechanic, the ability to wreck heavy armour. Now that would have been something. But what was the best polearm? Thinking in terms of the AD&D fighter, the weapon for all situations. The answer is none of these. Gygax's biggest mistake was to leave out the daddy of polearms, in my opinion, and that's the poleaxe. He probably did that because he knew that he would have to give it stats that were better than all the flashy swords put together. And we couldn't have that, could we? Hammerhead, spear, axe, 6-foot pole, bend armour, break bones, smash shields, cleave skulls, bosh! Well, I've been the Old Geek. I hope you enjoyed this video. See ya!